specifically doesn't just look at basketball hoops, kind of surprising, but he looks at bigger social and cultural issues as well. So everything from the closing of American factories to high school boys coming of age in a Midwestern inner city high school. So he really explores things outside of basketball, but I'm excited he's going to share this with you today. Bill lives in Durham right now, and he works as a professor at UNC Chapel Hill as well as the Duke Center for Documentary Studies. So without further ado, Bill Bamberger.
Thank you. My pal Brittany, and one of the wonderful curators who did the exhibition. How many of you have seen the exhibition at the Nasher? Okay, you have to promise me then. Two of us here? Okay. You should go see it. It is beautifully installed, and it was such a pleasure to work with a team of curators and with Molly, who was the lead curator. And I will talk a little bit about the presentation, about turning your work over to other curators, but I'm going to dig in mostly to the project itself. I think that's why we all came out tonight. But just my first request is, can we kill the lights in the back? It's just, yes, good. Thank you. I love being introduced as a living artist. When I first started taking pictures, the question was, what kind of artist am I? Are photographers even artists? And anyway, I think the term living is the one I'm going to go with. It works best for me. Here I am a month after the opening with a password that won't work. Sorry, folks. I have been taking pictures for many years, a graduate of UNC Chapel Hill, and right out of college I went to work as a photographer, and I really wanted to be a writer. This is a good place to do a presentation of my work because I feel like a writer here talking in one of our public libraries. But the details of, I loved writing, I loved the first draft, I loved telling large stories about the world we live in, but the editing process, the day-by-day process of kind of rewriting and staying with a piece until it was really finished was so tedious, I couldn't bear it. And then I discovered photography. And it was the technical side of it, it was the process itself, it was every part of it that was so interesting to me. And I thought, this is really similar in that we can tell large stories about the world we live in, and the technical piece just fascinated me. Sorry, Carter. And as Brittany said, I've been doing projects that are about the world we live in. A project about the closing of the oldest furniture factory in the South, the White Furniture Company in Mebane, North Carolina, founded in 1881, the same year the town of Mebane was incorporated and closing after 113 years. And what does that do to a whole community? What does that do to the workers? What does that say about work today and the loss of job? A project in Flint, Michigan about inner city youth growing up in a school with limited resources after working on a project about boys coming of age in a private boarding school, Deerfield, Massachusetts, and looking at the differences of those two schools and the similarities of adolescence and what it means to be a young man in our culture and to come of age in a world where things are changing in terms of our roles and responsibilities as men and in terms of how we see ourselves in terms of maleness, in terms of gender. Or a project about housing in America. And I'd been on about a 10-year run of doing these kinds of projects when I took my first photograph that would become the series Hoop in 2004. And you think, why go from projects about people, about life, that are mostly portrait-driven, to this kind of work? Well, those 10 years of those projects were all on location, a year in Flint, in the town of Mebane where I lived for a year, in San Antonio for a year, away from home doing projects. And they were hugely collaborative, often showing the work in the very communities where I would do this work. And after 10 years, I was kind of tired of people. I must say they're vastly overrated. So to have a project now that would be about place, that would be about landscape, where instead of asking permission to do a portrait and working with someone deeply to get to know them, I could look at simply a setting. And it was also at a time in my life where my marriage had ended, I was going through a difficult divorce, and just the notion of being able to do a project that was not collaborative, that would give me some time to reflect, to look at the world as we see it, that's a wonderful thing. And to take it anywhere I went. And instead of going to Flint, Michigan for a year and a half, or a year, I guess, for that project, I could travel the country and ultimately the world. And so I was traveling in Nags Head with a friend, and I saw this hoop, and I had thought about doing something like this previously, but there it was, this rental property right on the water, and I was just struck by the shutters, by how the backboard and the post was integrated into the design of the place. And this would be the first photograph that I would take for the series, lucky enough to have the number 1 repeated 4 times. And so I thought to myself, and let me say, I'm not the first to do a project about backboards or basketball, but I think as you look through the series, you'll see that maybe there's something different about it. I mean, for me, it was about thinking not just about the sport, which is so ubiquitous, as you will see in just a little bit, but also how it connects to our communities, to the places we live, to the character of different neighborhoods. And that's what started to interest me right from the outset. So I got back to Mebane, where I was living at the time, and I thought to myself, where are the interesting hoops in this town? And many of these I would find by simply driving around from place to place. I'll talk more about that. But this one in particular, I went to my mechanic, JR, a good country mechanic who could fix anything on my car the old school way, who was a hunter as well, would often have a deer hanging in his garage on a particular day. And I said, JR, did you ever play basketball? And he said, yes. I said, can you take me to, is the hoop where you played growing up, coming of age, still here in Mebane? He said, sure. I said, please take me to it. And so he drove me to this barn just about 4 or 5 miles from my home. I would have never found it otherwise. And I just thought it was so beautiful. And it is one of the images in the series that I see as being, I see these photographs, some of them as being quite painterly, as being about color and the lushness. And even here in a barn that is faded, that is decaying, with a little bit of growth around it, is quite beautiful just as an object in and of itself. And I thought, wow, if JR can lead me to a hoop like this, I can probably find them almost anywhere. In the work I do, I talked a little bit about the projects that I initiate as a photographer, some of which are funded, some of which are the origin of like the NEA, for instance. But I also do a good bit of freelance work, contract work. And this was an assignment for the Washington Post magazine to go underground into a year after. I don't know if any of you remember the Sago Disaster. This was taken, I think, in 2005, a year after 13 miners were trapped inside a mine. And the word came out that they had been saved when, in fact, they had been trapped, and all 13 of them died. And I went on assignment with Joby Warwick, a writer for the Washington Post, to do a cover story about the culture of mining in West Virginia and to go into the Pinnacle mines a year after. If you've never been underground, it's a remarkable experience to go into an underground series of tunnels about the third of the size of the city of Washington, D.C., is the way Joby described it. Just an enormous architecture of tunnels and a system, and to be in a place that's totally dark. This is lit by the, I think they call them, forgive the gender term, the man car that would take us through, and that's the only light in this space. It's quite striking when it's totally dark, and it's quite moving to be with these miners and to go underground with them and to be there for the morning prayer or whatever shift. Before each shift, they would take a moment to pray for their safety and camaraderie. And why this talk about miners when I'm talking to you about basketball courts? Because even in West Virginia, in the small town of North Fork, West Virginia, driving home with one of the miners, I would come upon this town, and as we would drive into the town of North Fork, I would see a sign that says, North Fork, the basketball capital of America. It's a tiny little town with a sparse population, and then I would see this court with the angel and the cross and reminders of what this community was, these grand houses up on a hill, also sort of fading with the town. I would go back the next morning to take this picture in the still light, but sort of remember it, and I would later call the library and say, how is it that you are the basketball capital of America, and this is a high school that in a small community that has won more state championships than any other high school in America? Just for fun, to finish up kind of this sidebar into the Washington Post story, this is the cover image that would run for the series. And what I like about it is when you look at this miner, anyone want to tell me anything they know about this particular miner just by looking at the picture? What can you tell me, if anything, that strikes you about this particular miner? Anything at all that comes to mind? Looks young. You're not, this is a trick question. You haven't given me the answer I want. I'm wondering to see if you will say he or she looks young, because this is a woman. And you really can't tell that initially when you look at this photograph. When you do an assignment for a magazine, it's pretty interesting. With the editor I was working with, my editor asked to give me my favorite 25 images, my favorite 50, my favorite 200, and then all the rest. This was, I think, in the top 200. I hadn't even thought about this as a cover image, and I like it because the story is about the men and women and others who go underground, mostly men, but not exclusively. And here's a woman who is part of the crew, who's mentioned in the story, who also happens to be lesbian and is out in this mining community, which you wouldn't expect. But just to put a miner who's a classic-looking miner on the cover and to not really think about that, but later come back as you read the story, realize that this is not, that this breaks our expectation a little bit. In a story that looks about how everyone's doing and what's going on, and I wish I could talk at length about what that was like, but we're going to move on, except to say that everywhere you look you find these basketball hoops. And here, as I'm leaving that region, again, another photograph from West Virginia, the back of a backboard in this case, and looking out at the mining community just outside North Fork, West Virginia. Another one in Logan. Some of you may know the John Sayles film about coal mining and the strike called Matewan. It's a fairly famous film of an earlier period, but it was filmed in Logan, and this is Logan, West Virginia. And so 3 in a row from the same place with the same idea, but all very different. And this one strikingly colorful and just, visually to me, just the cross of yellow, the stanchion coming down in the center, and that beautiful red, white, and blue net that one of our curators actually pointed out to me was held in place by duct tape. So if you look carefully, my pointer's not working, nor is my clicker, but you can see it up there on the rim, those little silver bars holding the net in place. Another assignment that was quite interesting to work on a Steven Soderbergh film with my close friend and colleague Alex Harris, who had just done a book about Cuba, and we went down there to film what would be the Battle of Santa Clara. It's the film called Che. It was a huge film, largest box office film and Spanish-speaking film, I think, in the history of filmmaking about the story of Che Guevara. And we're following these soldiers, and we're sort of photographing them along the way. And there's Benicio del Toro, who plays Che in the film. And it's really a kind of wonderful assignment. And we break for lunch on this day. And I go to see where all the extras are eating. And they're, of course, on a court in Campeche with the tables and chairs set up. Again, a basketball court that's a public space that in this case is the lunch spot for all these workers. So I began to see them everywhere, and the project was almost exclusively set in the United States because that's where my work was, that's where my travels were. But when I met Mary McKellar, my partner in life today, and just before we had our daughter Lillian, now 7, who's grown up with this project, we took our first vacation together as a couple. A lot of people go out for dinner and a movie. Mary decided we should go to South Africa first date. And we took a trip up to Namibia, and I had photographed a little bit. You'll see some pictures from South Africa. Of course, I had my camera with me. And in some of the most remote part of Namibia, we went on a safari. We traveled across to Sossusvlei. It's a beautiful country. It's a sparse landscape, and here in the middle of nowhere in a small town, is a basketball court at one of the local schools. I think Ocha, I forget, you might remember, forgetting the name of the town. And it's a different kind of court. There's no backboard. That's by intent. It's the sport of netball, a sport that is a non-contact sport that was invented to be a kind of parallel sport for women. Played in 3 divided areas on the court, and it has remained a kind of popular sport today in places like Africa, in Australia, and other places. That's not what struck me. I wasn't interested in netball. I simply saw a hoop, and I was zeroing in on another hoop as a photographer, and the minimal beauty of this space. Of course, I could have been there with children surrounding me, and there's some other images where maybe we'll talk about that, or I'll show an image of kind of what it looked like before and after, but I was just interested in the kind of design of the space, the shadow, the architecture, if you will, and there's just the pure, simple beauty that is that part of the world. Another photo from my travels with families. Now we're in a small town in Guatemala. And I love you take a concept as simple as a basketball court in a public space in a school and look at how that manifests itself and how different it plays out in so many schools around the world. And of course, you recognize Alice in Wonderland and all that that entails. There's precedent for the work I'm doing here. I'm not the first photographer to work in a series like this. I think one of the really remarkable bodies of work is the work of Bernd and Hilla Becker, who photographed blast furnaces, water towers, and architectural, industrial objects like these around the world. They are a hugely well-known German couple. They're married, German couple in work and in life and relationship. And what's so interesting about their work is the straightforward detail with which they photograph these objects. They consider themselves conceptual artists. And they will look at water towers, for instance, in places as diverse as New York, from Germany, pretty much everywhere around the world. Their approach is really different. And their approach is to photograph these towers or structures in neutral light with no shadows, with no distraction, in the kind of light so that the sky falls off. These are not digitally manipulated images. They're shot with large format cameras on film, very few changes, if any, made in the prints. But the idea is let the background go away. Let the object stand for itself and stand forward. And I apologize for not having bigger images of their work and just a book cover to kind of give you a sense of the whole series. Because if you were to look at them individually, you would see all of the rivets, the stairways in great detail. You would see the details of these structures. And you would be fascinated with the beauty and design and intent of these pieces of architecture. Or as they would say, pieces of art, because they're so remarkable in the way they're done. So it's a very interesting idea to take a single object and follow it around the world and look at how it's manifest in different cultures, in different communities, in different neighborhoods, in different plants. You find water towers on top of buildings in New York City as well, and some of those are in their series about water towers. But nothing could be farther from my intent. I was interested in the color, in the shadow, in the light, in how these things changed. I was interested in these hoops as they were integrated into the world, not as they were separated away from the world. And I think as a photographer, if you take any object and look at it carefully, it's interesting. My friend Alex Harris, who I mentioned earlier, I don't have examples of his work, but he did a book called The Idea of Cuba, where he looks at Jose Marti. And Jose Marti is a famous political figure in Cuba. He's like I think Alex describes him as a combination of Walt Whitman, Martin Luther King, and Moses. That's a pretty powerful combination as a figure, and there's statues of Jose Marti all over Cuba. And Alex has a series of Marti in these different places, and the point of it is looking at this figure who's so important, these statues as he overlooks these different places, and a kind of statement about this culture as it is happening day to day in the life of a place. A former student of mine, just to stick with Cuba for a second, let's pick on Cuba, did a book called Cuba TV. And the whole point of this book, it's not really about television sets, but wouldn't it be interesting just to shift gears to say, you're doing a project about TVs in America. Well, just about every American has a television. And if you were to go into everyone's living room or bedroom and photograph the TVs in a broad enough way so that you saw everything that surrounded them, you would have a glimpse of how we live, of what our rooms look like, what our houses look like all across the country. And if you did it around the world, how interesting. So, so there's precedent, and there's a really interesting precedent. And, but my approach was kind of like Cuba TV, or The Idea of Cuba, but with basketball. Let's look at these hoops, let's look at these backboards, but let's look at them integrated into place. Let's think about the clouds, the color, the parking lot in an Econo Lodge in Virginia, and the Blue Ridge landscape. This is a photograph in Greencastle, Pennsylvania. And again, what would this backboard and hoop be like separated from this landscape with a fading school bus that actually matches the color of the posts, in some ways of the square on the backboard, that's integrated into the scene. And with an American flag that speaks to this family or their neighbor's patriotism, and the sense that this sport is played everywhere, in backyards, in cities, on the side of grain silos, the picture we saw 3 or 4 images earlier, on the side of a grain silo in Portland, Oregon. In some cases, I would be driving around in this Greencastle, Pennsylvania. I thought, wow, what a lovely little town. I got off the highway. I was driving from the Northeast back home to North Carolina. And I would get off the interstate and just sounded like a great town for basketball, Greencastle, PA. Mm-hmm. Driving around sort of the main roads and driving around, a lot of these small towns have back roads where you can access your home or your garage from behind, and there's this hoop. Just kind of exploring, wandering, and it's something I've always had a love for. Even early days as a child, I remember trips with my family and being in the car, and you drive down, we often drove back roads then. Most of us took rural routes and wondering what lives were like in the different places that we'd pass by. Well, how wonderful as a photographer to have a project where you can stop and examine what life is like in all these different places with a singular metaphor of the sport of basketball. Here I am in Bethlehem, PA. I am a native of Pennsylvania, and I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I am a Southerner as well. I've been in North Carolina a long time, but just to show some allegiance. How many Southerners here in the room? Okay, well, I'm from South Philly, if that means anything, so a little bit Southern, right? So anyway, Pennsylvania is my home state. I've lived in North Carolina most of my life, and I've heard so much about Bethlehem. I've not spent much time there, but it's a town that's been depressed for many years in the Rust Belt. Bethlehem Steel had closed, and I thought, I'll go into Bethlehem and I'll find a hoop overlooking the steel plant, and that'll be kind of interesting. And I found that, and I don't think I have that images here. Our smart curators actually included that image in the exhibition with the titles, and maybe I can find it during a break here and come back to it. But it wasn't as good an image. It wasn't that interesting. So instead, I just drove around in the different neighborhoods, and I found this hoop and backboard here attached to a garage, and just kind of the plywood, on the garage doors, the cracked street, the sense of expanse gave, I think, a better feeling for what this town is facing, and the kind of loss of work, the kind of rundown kind of feeling of some of the neighborhoods, and kind of what's being lost in places like this. I think a stronger metaphor than maybe an image of a basketball court overlooking the steel plant. And maybe the same approach here in South Africa, in Khayelitsha, which is one of the townships, one of the poorest townships outside of South Africa. Again, this is a high school, and you can see a backboard that's been adulterated in a kind of wonderful way, Hoops for Hope here at the primary school, but you can also see one of the really poor tin-structured neighborhoods behind, an old airport sign, and all of the artifacts that kind of, show us the landscape between the community here of this school and the mountains beyond. This is in North Carolina, about 50 miles north of here. And I love, the way folks will adulterate a court, will, take a basic backyard basketball court, bring in chairs from an old abandoned, probably fast food joint, and make it a place for spectators. Now, before I go on, I talked a little bit about Cuba TV, about the idea of Cuba, about the idea of sort of photographing one object or one thing as it happens around the world. And I know what you might be thinking. Well, here is this fellow Alex Harris, who's photographing a figure who's as important as Moses, Martin Luther King, and Walt Whitman. Basketball, really? Well, basketball was invented in 1891 by James Naismith. It's the only sport invented in North America that's played at the Olympic level and at the pro level. Also at the college level, as we know, at the high school level. It is something that's truly American that we have created. It's a multi-billion-dollar sport. The average NBA team and the average men's NBA team is worth $1.5 or $1.4 billion. It's really a remarkable thing that we've created, and so, such a big business. And when you think of the money, the billions of dollars in the NBA, add to it, franchises like Nike, the sports apparel business, add the Women's National Basketball Association, add the leagues that are springing up around the world. It's a truly American form that we've exported as a kind of business around the world. not really my interest, except to say that it has a kind of import to this country that is remarkable when you think about it from a business point of view. But my interest, and I think this is what runs parallel with all my work, is in how does that play out in a community or neighborhood or day-to-day way. And that's why images like, I mean, someone asked me the other day, why haven't you photographed Cameron Indoor Stadium? I mean, in the emptiness or stillness of the place. It is a pretty remarkable court. Now, let me just say, I went to UNC, and so, but I teach it to, and we can get into that later, or maybe we won't have to. So why didn't you photograph, the Dean Dome or any of these coliseums that are remarkable? And you could argue that Cameron is one of the classic ones that remains. I mean, it's really a beautiful place. But that's a different project altogether. That would say something that's interesting. But when you see the sport as it manifests itself in the neighborhoods we live in the places where school children play around the world, that to me is a much more interesting idea or premise. And so that's the direction I took, looking for these basketball hoops anywhere I could find them. If you're a good North Carolinian, you know that this is not Savannah, you know it's not Charleston, you know that it's Wilmington in the historic district. And I love this image, just a simple hoop, attached to the side, of what is kind of that, the carriage house, if you will, the back of the main home actually. In the backyard, and if you're a cat lover, there you are. There's something for everyone right here. Kind of remarkable that you can take something that is 18 inches around, 10 feet off the ground. I mean, the specs are pretty clear for a basketball court. A backboard, a regulation backboard, is 3.5 feet wide, by 6 feet tall by 3.5 feet wide, rim 10 feet off the ground, 18 inches for the hoop. And yet you take that simple design premise and look at how it plays out, and it's almost endless, because it's really not so much, at least in our courtside project, and let's come back to the title in a bit. I'm calling this project Hoops, but our curators named the exhibition Courtside, which I think is a wonderful title for this work, a better title in many ways, because actually I'll speak to it now, because the project is about what is around the court, what's happening adjacent to it. It's not really about the hoop itself. It's not really just about basketball, but it's about the world surrounding basketball and how this sport integrates into neighborhoods, into places, and in this case, into life on the Upper West Side in New York City. I teased the curators a little bit at the opening of our exhibition. There are no photographs like this, and there are no photographs. I'm going to come back to that. I missed my cue here. This is actually not in the. This is an image that they might have included, even though it is run down. I like the backboards even without rims. I like even some of the posts that you find that are remembrances of where basketball courts existed. It's interesting to see how they faded in places, and it's interesting to see the brand new ones built in neighborhoods that are kind of making a statement about what's possible. So I think all are kind of interesting, just in terms of color, in terms of design, and in terms of the kind of the history of a place. Here's one in even home visiting my mom, who lives now in suburban New Jersey, a block and a half from her house. I can wander down the street, and there's a basketball court. And a pretty familiar sight, I think. If you were to look at suburbia around the country, you'll see backboards and hoops in driveways, and you'll see some attached to telephone poles. In Sewanee, Wyoming, I took a drive back went out with a friend. My friend was fly fishing. We were bringing a car back from Denver, Colorado, driving through Wyoming, through Colorado, through the Dakotas. And he was looking for good places to fish, and I was looking for good places to photograph. And here in the middle of nowhere, looking out at the plains, one of my favorite images, because just you take the simpleness of the plains, I can't kind of block it, and kind of that just beautiful landscape. And here's an old abandoned court that's been repurposed and repainted, and a playground. And I kind of love the sense of color that's been given back to it here in this place where there's very little color and such a minimal, beautiful landscape.
Bill, you set up such wonderful visual rhythms. It's like almost looking at a musical score.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you.
It's visual.
Mm-hmm.
It happens so much as you do each of these. They're stunning.
Well, thank you. And it does feel like that. And then imagine the score without the color, what it would be like to hit those notes, and then someone comes in and paints this. The image in West Virginia, that I talked about in North Fork was also a repurposed court, one that had faded and that the community had come back, and instead of building a new basketball court because they couldn't afford that, they repainted in their colors, the colors of that particular place. And sometimes the colors of place are very minimal. And here we are in Phoenix, in a city park in Phoenix, Arizona, where my wife and her family are from. And even there, you know, by the cacti, you can see an old, sort of forgotten basketball hoop and rim, and it's sort of fading to kind of look like the environment that it inhabits. And that's the point I was trying to make when I got crossed up a little bit here, too, is you take an old court, the post and the backboard, and as they begin to fade, the post starts to look like a tree trunk and starts to feel like it's part of the place that it's been sitting in for many, many years. I love this image. It's a sort of difficult image and yet a wonderful one, and also I think an image that has its own narrative. This is an abandoned school bus. I was driving down the highway in Tennessee. I've reached the point now, or I had at this point, I'm not actively photographing for this project, but at that point I could drive down the highway at 55 miles per hour and I could see a rim in the woods, and I noticed that backboard and what I thought was, and I thought, wow, that's fairly far removed from the highway. Pulled over, you know, just a little sidebar here. If you see me driving down the highway looking for hoops, stay away. Give me extra space on either side. So I pulled over and I walked down and I thought, wow, that is a backboard and a rim. The rim is made out of the hubcap from the bus. I went into the bus and it was clear from sort of looking around that a family had lived there for a while, probably a few months. I mean, there weren't the signs of kind of a permanent presence. A family that was likely itinerant, that had been wandering from place to place would be my guess. And there were children's toys and some food products, and so it had a feeling of being inhabited. But no longer inhabited. You know, the grass and weeds had grown up, so suggesting they had been gone for 2 or 3 months. And so, you know, hence the title, An Abandoned Campsite. But it also speaks to the ingenuity of all of us. Here's a family that, you know, wants to set up a backboard. They find a piece of plywood and no hoop, of course, and they make one out of the hubcap from the bus so that their children have a place to play while staying here. Any New Yorkers in the room? Okay, I didn't think so. Just upstate. Okay, so you might know that this is Brooklyn. That's a reach, but you know, I also have spent some time, and probably not enough time. I think if you were to critique this work, you might say, you know, basketball's played a lot in inner cities in this country, and I wish I had a few more of those images in the series. But the ones I have, I think, speak to kind of the sense of what our schoolyards look like and our basketball courts in those places. And to me, the geometry of this, the placement of the backboard at the very center of this courtyard, the sense that it's surrounded, and it is on 3 sides by the school, nestled in there, is quite remarkable. And the absence of a rim is also kind of an interesting thing. It begs the question, was it broken, you know, by someone dunking? Was it taken down to discourage people from playing after hours? There's even parts of this country in some of the cities where communities are wanting to have the rims taken down because they don't want gathering there in basketball, and they're seeing the sport as a place that brings kids that are going to do things and start trouble. And I think that's a kind of complicated and more interesting conversation that's worth having. I don't know the answers to that, but I know the questions to ask here. And of course, when you take these images as a photographer, you're not thinking those things. You're thinking more visually about what this says and how it fits into kind of a larger sense of kind of what's out there. Forgive the brief transition here, but an image I want to talk about a little bit because it'll lead us to another basketball court. I went in 2013 to Rwanda. I had never been there. Most Americans have not. The only thing I knew about Rwanda was about the genocide. I had seen the film Hotel Rwanda, which many of us have. I had read books about it. And as a photographer, I was going there. My wife was going to volunteer or to work on an internship at the Central Hospital. She's an infectious diseases physician, and asked me if I wanted to go along. We said yes, and we took our daughter there. She was 3 at the time, and I thought I would do a project, in a kind of post-genocide project. This was almost 20 years after this horrific event that was one of the great tragedies in the history of the world. And when I got to Rwanda, I realized that the genocide, not a distant memory, but was the only lens that people looked at this country through. So instead of a project about teenagers coming of age in Rwanda, I decided to do a modern-day portrait project of what the people really looked like. It's a warm, generous country. It's a country of great progress. And here's a student in one of the secondary schools in Gishita. And I was doing these portraits, and as I was traveling across the country, I would also come to these, in this case, a 3-hour bus ride to a remote part of Rwanda where I was doing a kind of portrait project of the students. I would see this hoop at the church, which is also part of the schoolyard. And what's so interesting about this image is that if you look at the courtyard here where it's played, you can see the lines that define the basketball court. And instead of painted on the asphalt, they are bricks that are laid into the clay. And again, the posts made sort of feel like, that everything about the structure sort of speaks to the place, but I've not seen this anywhere else, this kind of design, this kind of sense. And you find a similar kind of look of red clay. If you know Sedona, Arizona, it's also a strikingly beautiful place and one of the beautiful areas in our country. And so I like the sense of these two images with the red clay, but again, look at how the the court is delineated, the crisp white lines, the circles, the geometry, and it fits into its place equally intelligently, and yet it could not be much more different. Okay, I know what you're thinking. Yes, this swished right through the rim, no problem. I actually can shoot, but really no telling. I'm actually was shooting around with one of the kids in this local school. Before I would take the photograph here, there's my daughter Lillian at age 3 watching. There's Mary taking a picture of me. And the student who I'm shooting basketball with is actually shooting pictures of me, using my camera to take this picture. And this would be the photograph that I would take. This is the court. I mean, it's really different there could be pictures of people playing basketball in this court that would be kind of interesting. But to me, this kind of says so much more about the place, about this whole project, about the world that we live in. So from our project about Rwanda, back to North Carolina. And this is what I was going to say earlier. Our curators did not include in the exhibition, and they thought seriously about these kinds of images. This is more like the Becker's work. It's just the backboard. There's nothing there. This is not Photoshopped. The sky just washes out when it's shot in this kind of diffuse light. And I love this object. This is in Burgaw, North Carolina, down near Wilmington. I mean, it's the kind of backboard that someone who lived by the coast would build. Those same kind of piers or posts that you would see at our coast. The way just the sense of construction and the way that it's faded. It could be part of a pier or dock. It's not actually on the water. It's about 10 miles inland. And so the point is that I think the objects themselves are interesting, but when you do an exhibition of 26 images from a body of work that has hundreds of images, thousands of photographs taken, tens of thousands of photographs for this series, you have to make decisions. And what was so smart about our curatorial team is let's stick to a particular theme of focus here. Let's look at how these basketball courts interact with the world they inhabit. Let's look at what they say about America and about the sport that is American as it plays out around the world. Let's not spend our time and focus here looking just at the rims or hoops. They're interesting, but they're different. And yet, if I push back a little, how can you leave a basketball backboard out of the exhibition that says meat market? I mean, that's pretty darn good. So, you have to make choices always. Maybe, how many vegetarians on the curatorial team? Maybe that's why this was edited out, I don't know. But this is in Caswell County, from an old grocery store sign, an old meat market sign, obviously, and repurposed to become a basketball backboard. Now we're back deep into Mexico and near Oaxaca, and a little town outside of Oaxaca, and a house that's been added onto that has all these welding tools, and of course the backboard's made out of steel. So again, the kind of the building materials of place tell us about kind of what are run parallel with the backboard itself, and a young MBAer up and coming here in a small town outside Oaxaca. Also in Mexico City, another urban shot. Can you even find the backboard there in an apartment building? And so, again, so interesting to me to find this object in this place and how it fits into the landscape in a kind of remarkable structure that couldn't be more different than some of the rural structures you see in Mexico and around the world. On my trip from West Virginia, heading west through Kentucky, this is in rural Kentucky, and I do not change the scenes. I pretty much leave them, almost all of these, and I'll tell you if there are exceptions. I think there's one or two maybe in this series where I change things, but to come upon a place like that, I love those two chairs sitting parallel, and I love the balls sort of sitting on the chairs. That's the way it's left, that's the way I found it, and that's the photograph I would take. And I don't generally, maybe there's an exception or two. I don't walk into people's yards or take pictures of their home places or their hoops without asking permission. There was a family there. I'd ask the grandfather who was there if it was okay. I'd talk to him a little bit about the project. There were some children, and I would come into the yard and take this photograph. Because the project is never about that, I didn't keep careful notes or interviews. It would have been interesting to interview some of these families and talk to them, because some of them would say, we built this hoop for our grandchildren, it hasn't been used in years, or this one is at a public high school, it's the wrong transition image. But they would speak to kind of the history of the place, and that would be interesting. But it wasn't what I was after as an artist. For me, it was as much about the color, the setting, the beauty, the kind of the variety of something that's so basic as a 3.5 foot by 6 foot backboard and an 18-inch, a rim 18 inches in diameter. How does that play out in so many different places? Here's another high school, this one in Miami, Florida. And how different is that from the high school that we just saw in Sedona, Arizona? Some of my favorites are the landscapes that are so minimal, so simple, where maybe they are as much about the court, but this is a court in Portland, Maine, in a beautifully manicured part of Portland. Sailboats off in the distance, a carefully cut grass behind this perfectly aligned fence. Everything is in parallel and in order, and I think that also speaks to the character of this particular place. One of my favorites, Brittany's favorite in the exhibition, taken in a small town in Maine, and now I'm forgetting the name, Bridgeton, is that right? We're both in trouble here. It'll come to me, sorry. But I came upon this older couple sitting in those chairs. I was driving by, I saw this backboard, and I thought it was such a beautiful setting. And I asked them if I could take a photograph of their basketball court, and they said yes, it was built for the grandchildren who had moved away, hadn't used it in years. And instead of asking them to move, also because the light was too hard, I asked if I could come back the next day. So when I came back the next day, the two chairs were sitting over here, the garage door was open, and the car was gone. They actually parked their car in the garage. So I slid the door back, put the chairs back exactly where I had seen them, where they would sit and where they would leave them during the day, and took this photograph. This is in Jamaica. And again, something just as simple, a primary school in Jamaica, look at the colors. And our very simple rim with a perfect net and a plywood backboard sort of is, this is less about, of course, the basket and anything than just the colors of that place that are very familiar to someone who's been to Jamaica. One of my favorites in the series, another school, this time in Harlem, New York. And I love the colors, I love the hands reach, the hopefulness of this image, I love the geometry of it, and I love the basketball that's going up towards the sky, that they're reaching up. It's as if all these hands with different color skin are reaching up to the sky to grab this hoop, or maybe they're just trying to get a rebound. I don't know how you want to interpret this, metaphorically or just simply, but I just think it's kind of beautiful in terms of the design and the color, and I love the way the ivy has grown down over and into the hoop, and yet how it's still so carefully and perfectly maintained. And we're about to wrap up. As Brittany said, I've covered about 37 states plus or minus now, probably plus one or two more at this point. The project is sort of ongoing, but I've slowed for sure. And if I've missed any states, it's just because I haven't had the resources to get there. If you know of a place I should go to photograph a hoop, something that I've missed, and I said this at the opening, and I mean it tonight, all it will take is a round-trip ticket for two, and lodging and food, and I will fly coach, I really don't care, and I will go photograph your favorite hoop anywhere in the country or around the world. So just let me know. And that's it, we've circled around. Thank you so much, and I would love to field some questions, and if you have any questions about the design of the exhibition, we'll bring Brittany up here and she can talk about what it was to curate the show. I think I had a picture of one of the installation images that kind of give you a sense of what they look like. Just one room in the Nasher and one view of one of the rooms in the Nasher that gives you a sense of kind of the work on the walls and why you should go there to see the prints, which are about, some of them about 3.5, 4 feet by, almost 4 by 6 feet. They're quite beautiful as objects in and of themselves. So, thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, I wonder if you thought of what some of the images would be like, parenthetically. I mean, I'm noticing the great colors and how some of them repeat, the scoop will repeat the color of the building or whatever. But have you ever thought what they would look like in black and white?
It's a really good question. Can we kill the lights for a second? So the question is, for the purposes of Carter and those recording, the question is that what would some of these hoops look like in black and white? Because so many of the ones in the series were about the color or the colors repeating. And I thought about that, and let's see, adjustments. What's the quickest way to do this? Color, hue, saturation. So that's what that one looks like in black and white. What do you think?
What do I think it?
Do you like it in black and white? Color, black and white.
But you've worked in, I hope this is correct, I think you've worked in black and white previously.
I have. You're absolutely correct. And my work on closing was the first project that was in black and white and color. So here's some images from Closing, a project about the closing of the oldest furniture factory. And here, the workers and their lives are in black and white. I'm telling the story in black and white. But the portraits of many of the people on their last day of work are in color, and the large images of the interior of the factory. So here's a project that's color and black and white. You can see kind of like, just to give you a sense of how that can work, that it's interesting sometimes to do a project where you mix color, black and white day to day and color portraits of the workers. There's many things here. This is the installation, and this is on to Flint High School, which is also all black and white, except for the pictures of the project, the process. So to answer your question, let me speak to you directly again and kind of move back to where we were. I think these would be interesting in black and white, a lot of them. And I'll do one more and then we'll move on. Let's take this image because it's so colorful. If you were to desaturate this to black and white, that's still a pretty interesting image, isn't it? Because it's graphically so powerful, but it's a different image. I don't think there's any right answer for it, but for me, I think overall the color just adds another layer of texture and a contemporariness. Some of these are kind of, about, places where, the courts have faded and kind of are, run down a little bit. But here, this is a nicely kept one, and the geometry is so strong. That's interesting. But I still like it better this way. And I will say that the projector is amplifying the color. I actually didn't adjust this well enough before we started. We switched our projectors. The images are not this saturated. This is excessive. Jenny?
I really like that and correct me if I'm wrong, pretty much your perspective. I mean, it wouldn't be practical to carry a ladder around. It's like you're on the court and you're looking at the thing, and it's still really interesting. You don't have to do a funky profile. I mean, you get the whole backboard. Was that intentional, or?
Yes.
straightforward, yeah.
It was intentional, let me get rid of this, go away please. It was intentional to see the world from the ground as we would normally see it. And there are exceptions, but a lot of them, I did a whole lot in the series where they're so direct and so straightforward that I'd almost, with every court I visited, I would go, just one step away from the foul line and photograph it straight on, just like that. So you'd see the backboard. A lot of them would be horizontals, like this one in Portland. This one is a classic one like that. I remember seeing this, and of course, the geometry. And so some of it as a photographer is to think, what is the best angle? But I wanted to keep the angles simple. I didn't want this to be about like shooting up at the rim and fancy angles. I wanted the place to speak to us more than the photographer's sense of angle and perspective and all those things. So it was almost I wanted to take that away. And the other series I've seen like this, some of them, that's kind of more what they're about. Like, let's look up at the sky, and they're more photographic in a way, and this is stiller and simpler. So maybe, stealing an idea from the Beckers of keeping it straightforward. Not to say I didn't vary, but I wanted to see the world from that way. There were some exceptions like this one where to get this shot and make it look kind of straightforward, when you look at something like this, your eye adjusts for you and it corrects. If you look up, you don't kind of see the parallax in the way a photograph does. So I went up to about the 8th or 10th floor here and photographed, and I'm actually standing up. I keep pointing to the computer screen, no pointer. I'm like actually over here somewhere, down further on like maybe the 5th floor or so to get that. And I still had to adjust for parallax a little bit. So that was the idea, and I think it works in kind of the straightforwardness. And then there's kind of a sense of repeating itself. But in other images, one steps outside of that formula, because here, what would this tell you if I stood at the foul line? I am standing at the foul line, just another foul line, the opposite foul line, looking back, because I wanted to show how this court was utilized for something completely different. Yes?
Nice show, by the way, very nice.
Thank you.
When did you photograph your first backboard, and how many did you shoot before you realized this was your passion?
The first photograph was I think that first one, that might not have been that was actually, I think, the very first one, the one that I started the talk with. I wasn't fibbing to you, though you would never know. You couldn't bust me on this, but that was the first one I took for the series, absolutely, I remember it. So that was the first trip I took, and that was the first one that I took for the series, and I've kept it. It was a keeper. So that was back in 2004, I think I said. Am I right? I forget the dates. You need your curatorial friends to remember these dates, because it runs together when you've been doing something 13 now. We're into year 14 coming up, since we've turned the corner. And I think when my mechanic took me to that court with the red, barn, I thought this is something. But it was just, then I started driving around, and I think when I had reached like a mass of 15 or 20 images that I liked, I thought, this is really great. Then the challenge was, can I, on what budget can I manage this as a photographer and travel far enough and wide enough to make it interesting? Because to me, it was like, this is really an American project. And had I not met Mary McKellar and fallen in love with her and decided to start traveling the world with her, starting with our date in South Africa, I probably wouldn't have made it as international. But as a family, we started to travel more because that's my wife's interest. And and then with my own work, I continue to go back to Rwanda now. I'm traveling more and more. So I thought, when I started to see these around the world, I thought it's really more interesting. I mean, nothing in China. Basketball is played in so many places now around the world. Nothing from Russia, that would be interesting. And friends send me pictures from around the world. They just don't send me the plane ticket, so I can't get there. But the passion began kind of with, when I got to a kind of critical mass, and it's continued all these years, I can almost not turn it off. The beauty of an exhibition is that it gives you permission to say, it's kind of closure, okay, and to do something else and to focus your energies elsewhere. And I think you asked about how many, and we had counted. The curators had asked me, I thought I probably had shot the equivalent of I think I said 25, 30. No, well, maybe 2,000 prints, yeah. Probably about 20 to 30,000 frames. But that's, if you shoot 100 rolls of film a year, in the old days we shot film, would add up to quite a lot. It's not really that much. Photographers shoot tens of thousands of images over many year projects if they're shooting digitally. So I have some endurance. Yes?
Did you use the geometry in this one to try to focus the viewer's sight on something particular in there?
Does something occur to you? Do you have a sense?
The shutters, the yellow shutters above the windows. That's where my eye keeps going.
Early in looking at this, I was counting how many there were, because it was such a wonderful pattern. I agree.
You know, I always take credit for what people see in my photographs. I have no idea whether I saw that. I think that's probably true for most photographers. We see things, and sometimes it's like conscious, sometimes it's subconscious. It's like, wow, that's really beautiful,
Oh, come on, the
interesting.
visual rhythm of that grabbed you?
Well, the shutters grabbed me, and the color grabbed me, but I wasn't counting them, and I wasn't thinking like I'm going to frame this in such a way for the geometry. But as I was taking the picture, Diana knows this, I was thinking all those things,
And
absolutely.
the stair steps?
Yeah.
And the
You
cupola?
framed it with the stairs on the left and that building, that whatever that is on the
Little
right.
gazebo.
The gazebo,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah,
now,
it's perfectly
it was-
balanced.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you could argue, and honestly, that everything in almost all of these is intentional. It's kind of what we see. And if we miss, we sometimes have 3 or 4 other frames that are close. And sometimes, you know, again, I started to describe this. I shot this that way. I shot this way. I mean, it's kind of like doing a portrait. If you've ever done a portrait session, many of us, you do sometimes a straight on, you get people to be comfortable, you move around a little bit. I mean, sometimes you know immediately when you meet someone how you want to photograph them. Excuse me, I do a lot of portraits. And sometimes in talking to someone, before you take the portrait, you'll see a gesture or movement, you'll think that's them. As soon as you take the camera out, that disappears. So how do you get back to that? And sometimes you come upon a place and you see it and it strikes you. Now, how do you create that in the photograph? Where do you stand? How do you control those angles? And all of those things are part of the formula. But it's not like, I think an architect could sketch it out and maybe see it in a different kind of way than an artist. I think sometimes all of that is moving around in your brain and you're taking the picture and you're not sure. But after the fact, you see it, if you get it right. And, like this one, did I see like all, of course I saw the patterns there. How could you not? But then on the other hand, when I first walked upon it, it's like, wow, I just thought, wow, look at that color. And, for this series, I found my hoop now for this trip to Mexico. This is like they're everywhere. And I had been, the funny thing is in my downtime, I'd been looking and we were on the set and there's a hierarchy in filmmaking and we were at a pretty high level. So we ate with like the pretty senior people and not with Benicio. He had his own trailer. But like we were with like senior production people. And I thought, oh, I wonder where the extras are eating. I'll just walk around. And I thought, this is much better. So, when I came upon this, I knew. And I think and sometimes it is a design thing, and sometimes it's more of like a cultural thing. Just the sense of the street here interested me. Stephen Shore's work, I'll reference another photographer, just the kind of feeling of place that some photographers create. That's what interests me in an image like that, or an image like where is the one I'm looking from? Here. I mean, again, it's nicely composed, but just the place is so beautiful. And the clay is beautiful. It's too dark there, but we talked about that. I thought that was an interesting question. Thanks. Anybody else?
I just had one quick one.
Yeah, and I want to say, excuse me, and I'll take your question in a second. And Brittany, if you want to jump in at any point or want to add something or have remarks that you think are relevant, don't wait to be asked. Excuse me, sir. Go ahead.
Certainly. And I look at these photographs, and you said you had, thousands of photographs that you do. When you go to a location like this, I mean, I'm sure it varies widely, but how many photographs do you take at that one place? I'm sure it kind of depends on, the location and the artist.
It depends on, like in this case with Mary and Lillian there, I didn't have a lot of time. It's like, let's go. We were actually going on a week of vacation, though they were very patient. If I'm alone, I would say, I think another way to think about it is I would say that I would average, in this case I had a volunteer from the Peace Corps. When I traveled around Rwanda, because I didn't speak Kinyarwanda, which is the commonly spoken language, now the official language is English, which is curious, but still only the young people coming of age now are speaking English, and more educated and more affluent people in the cities and other places. I would often rely on the generosity of the Peace Corps, and I networked in Rwanda with the Peace Corps volunteers. And so here I was going to a village where one of the volunteers, was ready to host me. And, I would, 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 So I'm trying to answer your question, and sorry for the long-winded answer. But so I got to this court with Alex, was her name, and there was a bunch of people surrounding us, and kids and everything, and they were playing on the court, and then I waited for it to clear, and I had like maybe a minute where the court was empty. And so I shot from this perspective, from the other. I'll bet I only took 10 photographs, 10 frames for this shoot, and I got it. And I kind of knew when they were playing what I wanted to do. But in the case of some of the other ones, I would, here I shot up close, I shot different angles. I mean, I shot first from a distance, I went closer, I went onto the court, I shot. So some of them I would just, I would spend a half hour. If no one was with me, I might spend a half hour shooting a lot of, and I might not photograph all these angles. I'd walk to them, I'd look at it, and then I would decide. And ultimately, you kind of know, but sometimes you surprise yourself, like the distance shot in this case. I might have not have thought this was the keeper, the one that I liked most, but to me, in the end, it was the most unique, and I think the most beautiful, and I think in a way spoke to the place the most. This photograph, I shot a lot of different angles, but I knew when I took this one, that was it. There was no doubt that that was the composition for this particular court. And I think there was no doubt in Mexico City that that's what I was after. I mean, I knew what I was after before I took that. I shot a few other, and there's actually another court, a movable backboard and rim on this wall that has an interesting mural. I don't have the advantage of all of my visual notes, my outtakes, but it'd be interesting to show you all of the shots in a series and how you get to this. So for my next lecture, I will do that. To have like a whole page of just so you could see what a photographer sees as they're doing this. In the old days, when I started in film, it was all on contact sheets. And you would look at those and it would all be on a page. Now with digital, we kind of organize them in a different way and we overshoot because it's so easy to overshoot. And I think that's sort of a tragedy of kind of the digital world is that, give a photographer, 10 frames and say, get the photograph, and they'll think a lot more about what they're doing. And that kind of carefulness and thoughtfulness is, I think, valid and worthy and something that's lost in this era where you can instantly take images in so many of them. Okay, so that's probably, Brittany, do you have anything you would like to add to the conversation?
Yeah, so if you actually go back out to the kind of spread of images, so Bill has already narrowed down the images a little bit, but when we were curating, we had to narrow them down even more. And I didn't talk very much about this in the introduction, but it was really interesting for us to take all of Bill's photos and figure out which ones spoke to both the idea of community and universality, but were also strikingly beautiful. And there were many images that were so amazing and beautiful and vivid, but that we still didn't include because they didn't speak to our vision as curators. So that was one of the most interesting things, working with an artist who makes such visually beautiful pictures, but we wanted to choose one that specifically spoke to what we were trying to talk about, which was the idea of building community. And something that we did as curators was try to get an even sample of different places. So we looked at urban and rural and abandoned and active and vibrant and lower muted colors. So we tried to take these contrasting ideas and make sure we had an even sample of everything. So one of the things we were tasked with, Bill had about 6 or 7 different plains images. And so we chose that candy-colored plains image that he showed in the presentation, but we were trying not to pick too many images from one particular sector. We didn't want to over-represent one state or one country or one type of image. We really wanted to be representative, especially since we only had 26 image choices. So things like that, Bill, that second row, go over, that one there, go back.
Vertical.
So this image we looked at as curators and thought it was so beautiful. It was amazingly striking, but it didn't give us anything that the other images we chose didn't. And so this was an image that we really had to fight over, and one of the curators really defended this image, but eventually lost out because it just didn't speak to that idea of community and that idea of bringing people together. We didn't see too much of the court. A lot of the images we chose, we really saw the basketball court and the place where people played. We saw the ground where people played, and that does play into our title, like Bill talked about, courtside, that idea of being on the edge of the court, the photographers on the edge of the court, the viewers on the edge of the court. So most of the images we chose had that land. The silo is one exception. The silo is, if you go up, Bill.
It was up top.
Yeah, up. Left.
First one.
So this is one of the exceptions, an image that is in the exhibition, but doesn't have a court. But that was something that we did try to have as a central thread. and you'll see that.
And this is the actual set that we submitted, or that, became our working set of 65 images, I think. Let's see, there's probably a count here. 63 that we submitted to work with. So this was, so Brittany and the other curators came to my studio, they looked through a lot, and we kind of agreed on a working set. Some of it was my doing, but some were ones that interested them, and then they had to narrow. It's pretty hard to narrow someone's work from like 65 images down to 26. And 26 is still a lot of images in an exhibition. You can do an awful lot with it, but it's hard to make those choices. So anything else that strikes you here? The last one?
See, I think the beauty of your work is not only is it that visual, formal, wonderful approach of geometrics and patterns, but it's also a cultural portrait. And it's not just an environmental portrait, it's a cultural portrait. It's beautiful.
And from a curatorial standpoint, we had chosen the image from Jamaica that had similar colors.
That was the other one that
Yeah, so
was
that's why
sticking
this
out.
image was left out, because we had chosen that one to be in the exhibition.
It's a lovely series.
So, any last questions? Last call?
I just have to mention the one with the set of chairs that are behind and they're installed in the ground, but they look like they're floating. It's really, I just can't get my head around why would somebody would do that. I mean, is that a good location to sit and watch basketball?
I have to go back to the other set. They weren't even in the group that we were considering. I found a few extra for my talk that I just kind of thought were fun to kind of...
Volleyball field that we all went to, and there were these leftover shoe store row of chairs that used to always be at the
Where
volleyball
did they
field.
come from? Were they
So-
Some restaurant.
Yeah, and you think it's like a local, this is a home, and it actually I met all the folks. They weren't playing, it was a little cool on this day. Can I go out there? The family gathered around me, and I thought, this is a place where they play a lot. Look at how this is worn. I mean, there's no one needs to mow this grass. It's kept down, and you need a place to sit. So it's great that you have a whole set of seats. So I'll read a last paragraph as well that is some of the writing that I did when I was writing about this. And I think it sums up the whole question about, photographing these courts absent people. And then maybe we'll end on that note. And thank you for everything. Here we go. I never photographed the players, finding that the place spoke loudly about its users. I could easily imagine the players and in some cases met them, but more often in the stillness of the court, photographed in the early morning or late afternoon light. By just looking, I came to know a great deal about a community, its character and values. The setting of the court, the elements of its design and construction silently gave away more information about its place and inhabitants than the players themselves. A photograph of someone making a great shot or a great move takes place in a fraction of a second. But a photograph of that same court taken without people is about a period of time, the layered history of a place. It is about the people who played on that court, the people who built that community, who have come and gone. These courts without people engage our imagination the way a great portrait does. They make us think about all the life that led up to this moment, this expression, this place. Thanks, everyone.